I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. We are a local news show, but it is hard to report any news now without noting Trump effects. Much of the new president's actions, including unleashing Elon Musk and his team, have been shocking. But they are also expected, or should be. Trump campaigned and won based on these promises: the war on the bureaucracy, the trampling of the left's political preferences, the remaking of the post World War II federal government. What has come as a true surprise is foreign policy. Trump had telescoped displeasure with burden sharing and NATO, failures of the United Nations, the utility of climate agreements, but no one saw what was coming: an ambition for territorial expansion not seen in America since the Spanish-American War in 1898. It started with Greenland and the Panama Canal. Then he wanted Canada as the 51st state. And now he has proposed an American takeover of the Gaza Strip and the removal of all Palestinians. With Trump, it's always hard to know what's a play and what's intent. But 19th century style territorial ambition is frightening. The post-World War II international order created by Roosevelt delegitimized territorial expansion and occupation, no doubt unsuccessfully, and poorly binding even on the United States. But it did establish a new norm where conquest and coercion were not acceptable. Imperialism, even where it continued, needed a fig leaf, and that mitigated its worst instincts. If this norm is now abandoned, what do we say to Russia in Ukraine and Georgia, and China in Taiwan and the South China Sea? Okay, now that's out of the way. Back to local news. My guest today is data analyst, digital designer, and transit advocate David Schneider, who used to be a grants manager and data scientist for the Federal Transit Administration, which is part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. He left his federal job in 2024, way before the elections, to start his own transit and urban planning consulting business. Schneider has developed some really cool products, including dmvtransitourism.com, which anyone can use to see points of interest near transit stations. Schneider used his tool to analyze the vitality of neighborhoods in the DC region, developing a way to measure 18-hour neighborhoods, which indicate business and street use for the greater part of a 24-hour day. Stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning, especially when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Cat Scan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C. Paul Chaperas on bass and vocals, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. Their latest album, reflecting the time and this cultural moment, is called Everything is Normal. To feel better, go see them live. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have difficulty finding them, we share their events on I Hate Politics socials. David Schneider, welcome to Ahead Politics.
Thanks for having me.
You recently have done research and wrote about something called 18-hour neighborhoods. How did you come upon this? What is the idea?
Sinatra in New York sings, I want to wake up in the city that never sleeps, implying that New York is round the clock. Most cities are not round the clock like that, but there are many cities, in particular many neighborhoods, that attract people and are attractive places from roughly 6 a.m. till midnight, or 18 hours a day. So I'll give you an example of a day in the life of an 18-hour neighborhood. So in the early morning, you have people walking their dogs, maybe going to the gym, going to an early morning coffee shop. Then around 8 or 9, you've got daycare drop-off and school drop-off, as well as people going to work. Going into the morning, people may be going grocery shopping. Then during the midday, people going out having lunch. If there's a park nearby in the afternoon, you've got people taking their kids to the park. Then around 3 or 4, you get the daycare pickup, the school, people leaving school, foot traffic around those areas, people leaving work, maybe spending some time going to a pharmacy or a store on their way home. And then in the evening, you've got restaurants. And then towards the later parts of the day, from around maybe 9 to midnight, there's bars, there's nightclubs, there's maybe a movie theater or other places, and there's also maybe hotels. You might not spend your entire 18 hours there, but there's different people that come, and it provides a kind of vibrant neighborhood and economic activity. And ideally, if it's near a transit station, some walkable spaces as well.
You measured these various parameters within the DC area. What did you find?
I looked at areas around metro stations, as well as the commuter rail systems, MARC and Virginia Railway Express. 18-hour neighborhoods can be anywhere, but I was particularly interested in places that were near transit, so you don't have to drive and look around for parking. What I found was that there are 18-hour neighborhoods that exist all across the region, from downtown areas out into the exurbs. The way I kind of set a threshold for an 18-hour neighborhood was it had 30 or more points of interest within a half mile of a station. Now, my data doesn't have every single point of interest that you might be interested in, but I used my DMV Transit Tourism website that has coffee shops, restaurants, bars and nightlife, hotels, and pharmacies. So that kind of gives you the spread. So there are about almost 20% of the station areas in the region are what I call mature 18-hour neighborhoods. And then there are another 20% that I'm calling emerging 18-hour neighborhoods that have anywhere between 10 and 30 points of interest. But the majority, about 60% of the areas are primarily residential neighborhoods or office neighborhoods, or in the case of some of the commuter rail stations, really parking lot neighborhoods.
Within DC, what are the places that are 18 hours, and what are places that we think are 18 hours and are not?
One of the really interesting things about what I learned about the 18-hour neighborhoods in DC is how different some of these places are. And how their evolution to 18-hour neighborhoods are different. So some of the places you might expect are, places like DuPont Circle or Eastern Market, who have been popular destinations for many years, decades. In the case of Eastern Market, there's been a market there for, I think, 150 years, right? Then there are also residential neighborhoods that are primarily kind of industrial or commercial uses. I'm thinking of places like Noma, or the Navy Yard, that have seen kind of intensive growth, right, over the past 10 years. Looking out to the suburbs, you see places like the Arlington Corridor, which was, a lot of planning has gone in over the years to promoting transit-oriented development, or some places where county politics have focused heavily, like Bethesda and Silver Spring. So these are all but a day in the life of someplace like Noma is going to feel very different from a day in the life of someplace like DuPont Circle.
Explain that.
A place like Noma was planned back in the 2000s by DC, and it wasn't. I won't say it's a blank slate, right? But you'll see large residential apartment buildings, or at least large for DC, right, because of the height limit, and it kind of has a kind of a new city feel to it that attracts many people, right? As well as some adaptive reuses like Union Market. DuPont Circle, on the other hand, maybe it feels a little bit like you're in a kind of a European city, right? You're at row houses, the classic l'enfant design with the circle. Again, you can do an amenity count, and you'll see, there's X number of restaurants or X number of hotels. More in DuPont Circle than Noma, but the feel is different.
Yes, the architecture feels different. The physical layout feels different. However, is there really a difference in the life of the neighborhood? Does like a modern Noma neighborhood and an old-looking DuPont neighborhood, is there a real difference in the kind of measurement that you are trying to do, like in terms of intensity of life? Maybe you should call this the Sinatra-Schneider index.
So yeah. I mean, if you just kind of put a table together and you ask, does a neighborhood with 27 amenities really, is it different from a neighborhood with 35? And one is sort of drawing a line. No, I think some of the differences have to do with some of the pre-existing kind of transportation networks. And this will get, I think, even more stark when you go out in some of these, what I call emerging 18-hour neighborhoods in the suburbs. So think of a place like Rockville, which has a lot of destinations, but it also has Rockville Pike, or a place like out in Virginia, maybe Spring Hill or Greensboro. Again, a fair amount of interesting places within a half mile of a metro. But there's arterial roads, and then what I've also found is some places are kind of very clustered, right? You just go to one street, like maybe U Street, and like world is your oyster, right? If there's everything there. Other places, they've got the numbers, but they're more spread out, and they're just a little harder to navigate by foot, especially if you're a tourist. And I do think that, although I haven't lived in all these places, I've spent some time, and I just feel like the vibes are different.
Are there class differences? Are there race differences? Did you look at that?
Yeah. So one of the things I looked at was, are there any 18-hour neighborhoods east of the Anacostia River or in Prince George's County, which are predominantly Black neighborhoods, Black areas of the district? And I found only one emerging 18-hour neighborhood, Hyattsville Crossing, which used to be known as Prince George's County, and no 18-hour neighborhoods. And that's a problem. And I think that there are a number of reasons for that. There is historic redlining that has happened. There is contemporary bias. I mean, you'll hear people from Prince George's County bemoan the fact that there are a few white tablecloth restaurants in the county. I think there's certain biases against locating in some of these places. People chalk it up to the wealth or the economics, but I think there may be a racial bias as well. And then the other thing, of course, that if you've grown up in DC like I have, and you've seen neighborhoods change, and you've seen some of these vibrant communities emerge around metro stations. I mean, the other side of the coin of that is that, DC used to be Chocolate City, and I grew up in the 80s. And although I grew up in an affluent neighborhood, I grew up a few blocks north of the Van Ness metro station. You're aware of the power that people felt in the district, and the power of self-determination, and some of the loss that has happened. So that's, that is an issue. Now, that being said, just because it's an 18-hour neighborhood doesn't mean it's necessarily a predominantly white neighborhood. So I live in Silver Spring, and one of the most diverse places in the region is Silver Spring, and I really enjoy going to the culturally specific places and supporting some of the new businesses that happen to be Ethiopian immigrants in other places. I'm
a little bit surprised that Riverdale in Prince George's County, it's the lack of the metro station there, right? That is taking it off your list.
Yeah, and they do have a MARC station. And so part of this may be a little methodological, right? Maybe they just don't have quite enough places within my half-mile radius.
Are there any other places like that you missed?
Oh, boy. Well, sure. I mean, there's places that, like Georgetown or Adams Morgan, that just aren't on the metro line, right? And they are probably 18-hour neighborhoods. There's other places that, look, just because you're there's suburban 18-hour neighborhoods too, right? All of these places that I've mentioned, the coffee shops and the stores and the restaurants are located in a strip mall. And for nightlife, you've got the drive-through Wendy's, right? Sure, that activates the place, all that, but I wasn't really focused on those. I was really trying to focus on the places where people can go to without having to drive a car necessarily.
You did take out fast food restaurants from your measurement, right?
I did, and that was primarily because my source was an app for tourists who, my presumption, and I might be wrong, is they can get fast food at home, and so maybe they're looking for something special coming to DC.
So that's another interesting thing. This sort of tourism-driven understanding of neighborhood vibrancy, as opposed to a grassroots. I'm thinking of, like in New York, maybe Jackson Heights.
Mhm.
I'm sure there's some tourism in Jackson Heights, but also it's very vibrant locally. Do you see that difference? And how do you account? I mean, how would your methodology sort of work that difference?
I don't know if you've been ever on a metro with a kid and they're like, "Dad, I need to pee. Where can I get off?" Right? And at a basic level, is there a coffee shop near the metro? There are people, tourists, and maybe just people who are new to a city, who would drive to a place near a metro station, even though they're willing to use transit because they just didn't realize that they could get there, or they're driving outside of the transit shed, or they're just not making a trip at all. So I'm hoping that DMV Transit Tourism will help with that. And I think that, yeah, there are neighborhoods that are a mix of tourists and kind of local neighborhoods. I think, U Street is probably part of that. The issue, though, is you'll hear people complain about what's called Disneyfication, right? Which is, a really sterile neighborhood, and it's all in the eye of the beholder. But you don't have those culturally specific local places, and they've become kind of fast food chains. I don't have a Disneyfication index, right? And I think some of that's a bit subjective, but that's a legitimate thing that you hear.
The way that you calculated the 18-hour neighborhoods takes into account retail, it takes into account transit stations, but does it take into account people? What do you do to take into account actual usage versus, just having providers?
One of the things that is interesting to me, 5 years after the pandemic, is where are people going, right? It used to be historically that if you wanted to go to a place with bustle, you would go downtown, right? I remember that the oldie from Petula Clark, like when you're alone and life is making you lonely, you can always go downtown, right? And that's kind of the memory of the hubbub. But look, people are working from home now. Not everyone, may change a bit, but certainly travel patterns and patterns that are changing. And so when you mention people, it's like, well, where are there more people now? In more suburban or even exurban places. Downtown DC, you hear, well, it's a ghost town. All I know is there's a lot of businesses that are open, right? And they probably wouldn't be open for very long if there weren't that many people, either tourists or people coming from the neighborhood that are. So I feel like the number of businesses is a relatively good proxy.
I want to ask you about the difference you saw between urban core, suburban, and exurban location.
I looked at, these sort of 4 layers, urban core, which I defined as stations that are kind of hugging the National Mall. What I found was a mix of 18-hour neighborhoods and not 18-hour neighborhoods in that area too, right? I mean, just because you're downtown doesn't mean, you've got things around. It could just be offices. But to your point about suburban versus exurban, yeah, there are a couple places on the MARC line and the Virginia Railway Express line. I'm thinking downtown Fredericksburg, which is my one 18-hour community in an exurban location. Places like Frederick, places like Manassas, Virginia, Quantico, that have you'll see a kind of street grid, right? What looks like a pretty walkable area. Not a lot of amenities, at least in my 5 categories. Again, there's probably more than that. But I do think that there are opportunities to have more vibrant places in the exurbs. Now, in terms of getting there, typically the MARC will take you into town in the morning and then out of town in the evening. So there's not this kind of round trip service. And I think it's the same on the VRE. But it could be an interesting day trip or an overnight trip for people that want to do that. And frankly, a more interesting and economically prosperous place for people that live around here.
Almost all the measures, apart from the transit station itself, are private venues, locations, however you want to call it. There are few public places, except the streets themselves, of course. And I think that saddened me a little bit. I've thought about this in terms of younger people. Where do teenagers go if they don't want to pay for coffee? And there are places that are assigned for certain activity, soccer field. So it's basements. It's sometimes the edges of parks, because even parks are for less than 12-year-old. What about public spaces?
So there are libraries. There are some community centers. There are some parks. They're there. But you make a good point. Some of these neighborhoods, there's sometimes they're called urban playgrounds, right? Where it's fine if you want to get a $5 latte, but what I need is good childcare. It's a fair point, and I think when we're thinking about some of these 18-hour neighborhoods, we ought to think about places that you don't have to pay admission for to enjoy.
Co-location of public facilities. The metro doesn't think about libraries next to it. And there are different agencies, different levels of government. That's a huge ask in terms of just simply the coordination problem.
Yeah, it is. And there's also different levels of planning, right? But it really is a planning issue. Sometimes you can shoehorn things in after the fact and do infill. That's definitely possible. But when people are thinking about some of these new places, and there's not that many new places planned for DC. But I'll just give you an example. Let's talk about RFK Stadium, right? I mean, there's an opportunity, and I'm not going to weigh in on whether there should be a stadium or not, but there's a place where right now there's a stadium that's going to be torn down. There's parking lots. It's close to a metro. Can we have some of these things that benefit the private sector as well as just free to the public, open to the public?
In the Washington, D.C., the broader region, what do you find most exciting in terms of sort of neighborhood development? And I'm asking this question with one context. The immigration pattern, particularly in the Washington, D.C. region, has been that immigrants don't move to the urban core. They move to the suburbs, right? So Rockville has perhaps the best Asian food of anywhere. But if you want Vietnamese, you got to go to Eden Center in Fairfax. How does this play in?
That's a really, really big asset for urbanism in many places. So one of the things I might do in my app is add a cuisine tracker, right? So where can I get sushi on the red line? Right? Where can I get, pizza on the green line, right? I mean, for the food tourism. But look, I mean, in a world where in many places immigrant communities are being denigrated, right? Or being considered the enemy, or thinking about being deported. I mean, one of the things that I love about living in DC is that so many of our immigrant communities have brought so much in terms of not just restaurants, but other places, very culturally specific. So I live, as I mentioned, in Silver Spring. A street that I visited in December is a street called Bonifant Street, which is a small street right outside of downtown. It's currently being torn up by the Purple Line, and eventually that construction will end, and there'll be a light rail. But most of the businesses there are in a mom and pop, not a ton of political power, and they're struggling. But those are the kind of businesses that make a community an interesting place, right? And provide support, and ideally places to build wealth for people that are new arrivals to America.
Well, I got to ask about the Purple Line dislocation at this point, right? Urban cores are hard to build in. They take long and it's expensive, but it's also rewarding at the end. But the cost is borne by current residents who are perhaps the least able to afford things, because once, a newer income class moves in, that just makes a difference. And I'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of what are some things have you thought about that can be done to preserve neighborhood vibrancy during construction?
The county and the state are trying. The Purple Line transit partners have been doing work, but I think ultimately people have to step up and support these places. And then afterwards, it's harder, probably a little bit more of a policy question, right? In terms of, well, what's going to happen when these places open and the value of the land is higher and the landlords now want to, sell out.
The other question I have is we talk about coffee shops a lot. I mean, there's an episode I did asking how many coffee shops does Silver Spring need? At that time, I counted 22.
Whatever the market can bear.
Let me ask about this market can bear, because that also pertains to the initial idea that you had, is that you're going to use retail as a measure of people. So if you look at the coffee shops in Silver Spring, it seems that they are 21, 22 coffee shops in Silver Spring, but the store owners are rotating. So they are closing and reopening, closing and reopening. So my hypothesis was that this is because building owners, they would like to have a coffee shop under their building. So they probably subsidize or charge lower rent for the coffee shop than they might charge for, say, something else.
I do spend a lot of time in there. They're busy, right? I mean, I don't think that the reason that they're open is because they're being subsidized, right? Maybe that's part of it. But they do attract a kind of a clientele, right? Now, another businesses that I'm scratching my head, and maybe you can help me out with this, but there's a lot of, are bank branches. And they're like, I never see people, right? And what do bank branches offer you? Well, they offer you money if you have money. They're not giving it away. They are not a kind of thing that I feel like a restaurant or a bar. You might not love bars, but they offer something to people. What do bank branches offer?
Your larger argument is about neighborhood vibrancy, right? And almost everybody is interested in cracking that nut. So what advice do you have based on your work about what governments can do, what planning departments can do to enable neighborhood vibrancy?
Right. Well, I think my first piece of advice, and again, it's not groundbreaking, is not to treat a neighborhood like a blank slate and not to treat different neighborhoods like the same. So that's one issue. I mean, anytime you propose something new, you will most likely get pushback. I mean, I remember you may have read articles about the debate over Call Your Mother in Georgetown, right? It's a bagel shop and neighborhoods where people were complaining that people were eating bagels and leaving their trash on the stoops. I don't know. You can call it a smear campaign if you want to. But to be serious, when it comes to things like nightlife, like bars, I mean, there are some, I think I'm sympathetic to concerns about noise, to concerns about rowdy behavior, et cetera. So there's going to be some, like, well, why does this have to change? But going beyond that, I think that you just need to again, I think you brought it up, some of these coordination issues.
Several years ago, Montgomery County had a task force on nightlife in Silver Spring. And that created the policy structure for Silver Spring nightlife that exists today. But of course, that ended up in more violence and criminal activity and all of that, and complaints around that. And since then, Montgomery County has pulled back. And now Montgomery County Police will determine whether you have sufficient security apparatuses in place to be able to stay open till 2 a.m. or whatever it is.
Back to my 18-hour neighborhood concept, right? I'm not necessarily saying 24-hour neighborhoods are the ideal, right? And maybe some of these places, and I don't know, it's not like Gremlins, like if you're open after midnight, it's all bad. But maybe some of these places that cater to the really late night crowd. And I do remember, as a Silver Spring resident, a number of crimes happening at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, whether they were connected to businesses, I don't know. I don't want to sort of blame a certain business. But yeah, there's a balance. And I think people need to be conscious of that.
Is the balance only arrived at organically, or is there some sort of first principles?
As much as I worry about not in my backyard, I do think that the planning, the community involvement and public involvement process is important. So listening to people and listening to their concerns. And if their concerns are about a lot of late night crime, then thinking about, well, maybe Maybe you got to close at midnight. That's still a long way away from a neighborhood where nothing goes on except for parking or people driving to their office.
Did you think about adding a crime layer on your research?
I'm nervous about adding things like crime layers because I think there's so much perception and sometimes so much bias that goes into that. A lot of crime happens between people that know one another, right?
Right.
But if you start adding it to the neighborhood, then your tourists will, well, this is a quote unquote bad neighborhood, right? I don't want to be there. That something's going to happen to me. And sure, occasionally it does and it makes the news. But I really wanted to stay away from thinking about neighborhoods through the lens of crime.
What else are you thinking about in the future now?
First of all, I'd like to continue working on promoting my website and making it attractive for people to use. Well, one of the things I'm doing is I'm going onto DMV to a tourist site called it's like DC by foot, and you will be amazed that every day there are people that are like, I'm coming to DC. Where are the hotels near transit? I'm coming to DC. How do I get around? Right. So it's like, well, let's go to this. So I would like to make this a commercially viable business down the road. Another thing I'm working on that goes way beyond DC is a data platform that looks at areas around transit stations nationally. So where are the 18-hour neighborhoods or potential 18-hour neighborhoods in other cities? The methodology is there to make this happen other places.
Plug your app and your website, please.
So my app is called dmvtransittourism.com, and it's available online and it's available on the App Store and coming soon to Google Play. And I hope people use it. My catchline is have a real good time.
Thank you for making us have a good time, David.
Well, thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
What lessons can we draw from my conversation with urban planning consultant, data analyst, and tourism app maker David Schneider? First, think of David Schneider's app as an extension of the walkability score in Zillow. I bet there's plenty of correlation between the walkability score and Schneider's 18-hour neighborhood concept. Schneider himself is using retail presence as a proxy for walkability. But more importantly, Schneider is getting at something that planners and elected officials all want, but are not always successful in getting. To take an example close to my home, the city of Rockville has for years tried to make a go of its town center without great success. The same real estate company, Federal Realty, built, owned, and until recently operated the town center, but could not make it viable. But just 3 miles south on Rockville Pike, Federal Realty's Pike and Rose development has taken off like a rocket. Let's not also forget that the city of Rockville started thinking about revitalizing the town center when Doug Duncan was mayor. Duncan went on to become Montgomery County executive and spearheaded the enormously successful redevelopment of downtown Silver Spring. It's puzzling, really. We really do have a coordination problem when it comes to planning, and especially with respect to co-location of public amenities. Washington Metro is a multi-jurisdictional and independently run agency. Planning is a county-level function. The actual development is in the hands of private companies. Consider the fate of the universities at Shady Grove, where I work. More than 20 years ago, someone put a college campus 5 miles from the metro. They could have built it on top of Shady Grove Metro Station, but clearly the University System of Maryland controlled land 5 miles away and not near Metro. Being able to build public spaces near transportation, but also creating the vibe of a thriving marketplace that attracts people remains a challenge. That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analysis. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from CatScan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C., Paul Chaparis on bass and vocals, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. Their latest album reflecting the time and this cultural moment is called Everything is Normal. To feel better, go see them live. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have difficulty finding them, we share their events on I Hate Politics socials. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.